Hello and welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is the program where we bring you up to speed with the latest political developments on the continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.
And I'm Rita Omodia. It's another day of the conversation right here on News Central TV. And today we will be discussing the state of security in the Central African Republic, where Russian mercenaries have been accused of torturing and killing civilians. We will also look at the state of the media and press freedom in Africa.
Now, Human Rights Watch has accused forces in the Central African Republic, whom witnesses identified as Russian, to have summarily executed, tortured and beaten civilians since 2019. It calls on the national authorities, the country's special criminal court and the International Criminal Court to investigate this incident, as well as other credible allegations of abuse by Russian-linked forces with a view to criminal prosecution.
Now, the Central African Republic, which has been in crisis since late 2012, when mostly Muslim secular rebels began a military campaign against the government of former President Francois Bozize, has been in alliance with the Russian government, to quell the crisis. Now, joining us live for this conversation, we have Vincent Obisie-Orlu, a researcher with Good Governance Africa. He joins us from Johannesburg, South Africa. It's good to have you join us on the conversation.
Thank you so much. It's good to be back.
Thank you. So, Vincent, let's start with the allegations. The UN, the European Union, and countries such as France have accused Wagner's mercenaries of committing crimes and abuses against civilians. What are your thoughts on this, and do you believe that these charges are actually valid?
So, to start off with, the Central African Republic's president has denied using or making use of Russian mercenaries. But the question must be asked now, right? Who are these strange white men who are guarding him? If they're not mercenaries, are they Russian soldiers that he's making use of as part of his security detail? And if they are Russian soldiers, they're part of his official security detail, or they're part, and Russian soldiers are part of the security forces or engaged in security activity in the Central African Republic, then this raises further questions as to what is the role that Russia and Russian forces, if they're not mercenaries, are playing in Central African Republic. So that's that I'd like us to present that. I'd like to present that to start off with. Second, look, these allegations of abuses by Russian mercenaries and Russian forces in Central African Republic of the Wagner Group are not something that is new. The Wagner Group has been known to engage in significant disrespects and abuses of human rights on the continent, as well as in their operations when they're in Syria.
Vincent, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, all right. Okay, so Vincent, if we're looking at situations in late 2020, now President Faustin Archange Touadera called on Moscow to rescue a weak and destitute army to repel a rebel offensive that threatened Bangui and the regime. Now, you're saying that these allegations have been going on for some time now. Now, in your own view, do you feel it was wrong? It was a wrong call by the president, or actually the best bet in dealing with the rebels?
To bring in the Russians into the situation on the ground.
Yes.
Look, we have the African Union and African Union peacekeeping forces. This is an indictment on the AU and the whole region of Africa itself, that a country's president cannot depend or say to the African security forces and peacekeeping missions that come and help us and support us in keeping peace in our country as we face this offensive. This is a major indictment. Additionally, this is also a show that Russia is moving into areas and engaging in areas that were previously outside and external to what it considered its sphere of influence. The Central African Republic was once considered and viewed as France's sphere of influence. So Russia's engagement in that is not surprising, as Russia has been consistently making inroads into the continent. But it's also disappointing at the same time that African leaders were not able to engage and in a purposeful action to prepare a peacekeeping force or an effective peacekeeping force that would manage the situation without having to bring Russia into the mix.
Okay, looking at an ideal world where all things being equal, the Central African Republic, Mali, and other countries that used to be colonized by France should be able to take care of the security needs, but the reality is different. Why do we, what's wrong with an independent country choosing who it wants to do business with, looking at being pragmatic? They tried the French, looking at Mali, for example, Operation Barkhane, and the French intervention there didn't really solve the problems of terrorism. And now the Malian government is looking at doing business with Russia and looking at other options in order to tackle the problem of insecurity. And we've also seen this, like you rightly mentioned, in places that were formerly under the sphere of influence of France. What do you think has led to this breakdown in relationships with former colonial countries that were traditionally French, seeking all the partnerships, especially military alliances with Russia?
Well, one aspect of the breakdown in these relationships, military relationships with former colonial powers, is the fact that a lot of these countries wanted or did not agree with the way in which France was approaching the issues. Some of these countries, the militaries in these countries, which need to be understood as forming a major part of the governing coalitions or forming a major part of the governance structure of the country, even though it is civilian rule, the military still occupies a significant role in these countries. And as a result of that, their disagreements with how the French, in the example of the Central African Republic previous, engaged, as well as how the history of what the French wanted in return was viewed as antithetical to what the government wanted and was willing to give. But also, Russia came in to make offers and promises of what more it can do, how it can benefit not only the country and its governments, but also what it can do, the promises of development they can bring, and the military hardware it can bring in and have on the floor for the Central Africans and Malians to use in their fight against the rebels and other groups. Now, progress under France in the case of Mali is very important to keep in mind that the initial mission of Mali, of French troops in Mali, had been to prevent and protect a certain region. Then it moved on and mission creep occurred, and it was now just this amorphous counterterrorism operation without clear objectives of how to achieve the goals. Now, the Malian military was suffering from a lack of equipment, but also a lack of collaboration, effective collaboration with their French counterparts. And yes, sure, there are accusations that are often made about colonial powers maintaining and keeping and holding on to colonial reigns, even as countries have decolonized. And so to some countries, Russia is the devil they don't know. In these situations, they were never a colonial power. They never had the colonial angst or struggle with Russia. And as a result, they'll move towards Russia and agree to make deals with Russia and
Vincent,
Russian
sorry
countries.
to
There's no
interrupt you.
problem with.
In terms of pragmatism and results, we've seen that there's, even though it's a graveyard piece, there's some relative type of stability in the Central African Republic since they engaged the Russians.
Yes, the Central African Republic has gained some semblance of stability. In terms of pragmatism, that is going to be seen in the future because bills always come to you regardless of what deal you're making. And that when that bill comes due with the Russians, we don't know what the conditions of Russian engagement and intervention and support are. So my concern in this is that in as much as pragmatism must win the day or will always win the day in terms of who can give you the best bang for your buck and who can help you achieve your objectives, when the bill comes due, Russia does not necessarily have the same level of attachment or focus in terms of the stability and security of the Central African Republic that, say, France might have had in the past.
All right, when we're looking at situations in the Central African Republic, especially going the line of colonial powers and foreign powers, we also got information in February 2022 that the African Union Commissioners for Political Affairs, Peace and Security said he wanted to completely exclude mercenaries from the continent. Do you think that is possible?
Well, in the way in which African countries have come to engage in handling and managing the insecurity in their countries, there are numerous mercenaries operating all around the continent. Some are South Africans, some are French, some are Russian. To move towards a situation where we're completely removing mercenaries from all conflicts on the continent is going to be a very difficult one to do. But in the long run, I believe it's possible.
And you think that the Central African Republic, the army, that the military is well equipped to deal with the rebels?
I believe that the Central African Republic's military is not well equipped to deal with the rebels, but I also believe that the issues in the African Republic go beyond something that is just a simple military engagement. It requires significant effective governance changes in the Central African Republic that are not just one group is shooting at the other group and trying to win a military offensive. There are governance problems and governance challenges and issues that have caused this instability, that have caused people to take up arms and engage in these conflicts. So just having military equipment is not going to be the way to solve the problem. Governance and good governance is going to be essential. So no, I do not believe that the Central African Republic army on its own is equipped effectively to handle the security situation. I believe that they can be trained and upskilled, be it through Russian trainers and military trainers and supervisors, or French military.
Hello, Vincent. Are you still with us? Hello, Vincent.
Right, that's a very terrible situation we're having in Central African Republic, especially with the accusations. We've seen the Russian come into the Central African Republic to try and quell situations, the crisis, especially security situations going on in Central African Republic. And we've seen a lot of people who have died as a result of this clash that started since 2012. And now the Russian mercenaries are now being accused of having committed human rights violations.
You know, we always get accusations and counter accusations. It would be nice for those that are making accusations to also present evidence, because I know that when it comes to engagements, and I can feel that resentment and maybe, for lack of a better word, jealousy when it comes to, you know, I used to run this place.
Or political gimmicks.
I used to run this place. This was my sphere of influence, and the Russians are here. So we see a lot of, I hope we have Vincent back soon.
Yes,
so we see a lot of resentment from Western powers that why are you engaging with Russians? But President Austin Ashanti-Odera, he does have the interest of the people at heart, the Central African Republic, and he would have looked at all the options on the table.
Before
but when
bringing
I
in
asked
Russians.
Vincent, he did say that it's too early. For the sake of pragmatism, it might look like, you know, things are working. Bangui is calm. Things are not as bad as they used to be because of the Russian intervention. But at what cost? What's the bill? It's too early to tell. And,
Still looking at the accusations and counter accusations that have been posed on the Russian Wagner Group, we also have other accusations that since it arrived in the CAR in 2017, the Russian mercenary Wagner Group has been accused of focusing on securing mining concessions and sites. Now, Vincent, what's your take on this? Because we're having accusations of human rights violations, torture. Now, we see a situation where it's more like the Russians didn't really come to help CAR in security, but they're also after mining concessions and sites. What's your take on this?
The Wagner Group being accused of having focused on the resources of the country is not surprising. When Russia engaged and made its engagements in the CAR, there were conditions as to what was given and what would be exchanged, what the parts in terms of the agreements would be. It seems that mining and access to mines and the critical minerals that are in the Central African Republic were part and parcel of this. This is what I mean by we don't know what was in the deals, but we also don't know what the bill is going to be when it comes due. Wagner Group's accusations that the Wagner Group has just been focused on securing of these shows or presents a window to look at these situations through which we see a force that's engaged in the country, but not necessarily for the security of the entire country, but rather for the securing of access to resources and extraction of resources from the country to the benefactors and the motherland of this supporting force. So in some ways, you've gone from, I apologize.
Yeah.
In some ways, you've gone from the French with their colonial ambitions and post-colonial management and handling of the situation and access to resources to now the Russians. So yes, while these accusations have been made, we're seeing that there's more to this situation that meets the eye for us to see.
So it feels like we're in the middle of geopolitical schism. So you have the West on one side and Russia on one side, and Africa is the price, is the bride in the middle. Now, Vincent, looking at the geopolitical implications of Russia's presence in Africa, do you think we're back to Cold War era politics? Because we see a lot of rhetoric when it comes to Russia's presence in Africa. The West is not really comfortable with it. That's why the French withdrew Operation Barkhane in Mali. In faraway Australia, just a few weeks ago, the Solomon Islands signed a defense pact with Russia. Solomon Islands is 2,000 kilometers from Australia, but the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said they have crossed the red line. Are these countries, African countries, in the middle of a geopolitical struggle? And are we seeing Cold War 2.0 going on?
We are definitely seeing African and developing countries caught in the middle of geopolitical great power politics or major power politics in terms of how you align and what your potential punishment is going to be if you don't align the right way. We saw this very clearly in the numerous condemnations of several African countries who did not vote in favor of sanctioning Russia at the UN General Assembly following the invasion of Ukraine. These same people who are speaking about African countries not speaking out to sanction Russia or abstaining or voting in support of Russia do not understand or have not been able to process, if you will, that more African countries were voting against and abstaining than had occurred in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. Yes, there's definitely greater geopolitical games and gamesmanship occurring. And Africa is once more the center of this game. One, because of its resources. The resources that Africa has will be essential for the future of the global economy. This green revolution that we consistently hear being spoken about internationally, Africa has many of these critical minerals. Two is for the fact that Africa has a growing population and is going to be a major player in the years to come in terms of how and what happens in the world stage. With a growing population, Africa has a huge market for countries to have their products sold in and produced in. Africa, some have said that some African countries might become China's new China. And we can see this beginning to happen.
So
But
Vincent, how can African
yeah,
countries and how can Africa as a continent better position itself to be on the better, to get the better half of this deal? Because I know that no country is an island and we do have to have relations with other continents and nations. So how can we make sure that these relationships that we have are mutually beneficial to us?
well, so on one hand, countries will need to have their standard by which they engage in their trade agreements and stand by them. On the other hand, countries will also need to decide partners that fit their value system, be it that you and stand firm on that. There cannot be, in order for African countries to effectively benefit from all of this, countries cannot be flip-flopping on today we're in the Western camp, tomorrow we are in the Chinese camp, the week after we're in the Russian camp. No, the deals that are made are multi-year deals. These are deals that are not something that you can just change willy-nilly tomorrow. Thirdly, African countries will need to have a policy come together in terms of the African Union, or like to see the African Union coming in and helping and supporting African countries or regional blocs on how they approach and how they engage with different international partners. You cannot have a situation where just because Southern Africa used to be the region that the Americans had as a playground once upon a time. Now, SADC just kowtows even in situations where there's no interest for a country like Lesotho or Mozambique to agree to these arrangements. So African countries are going to need to brace themselves for taking choices, but also they're going to need to make tough decisions on who they're going to agree with, and they will need to be value aligned.
Okay, Vincent, it's more about alliances now. But earlier on, you talked about sanctions. And I know that the EU has actually sanctioned a number of individuals and, of course, supposedly oligarchs that are involved in the Wagner group. Now, what effect do you think the sanctions will have on the group and especially in the Central African Republic?
None. I don't think that the sanctions are going to have any effect on Wagner. You can sanction a mercenary group that on paper does not, we don't know who the owner is on paper, who owns and manages and supplies and provides assistance and support to them. On paper, they do not exist. In reality, we know they exist. So the sanctions won't really have much an effect, especially if they can still have clients and potential African countries and countries around the world who need or want their services. So I maybe I'm a pessimist at this point in time, but to sanction Wagner is not going to work if you're sanctioning just the oligarchs. If you're sanctioning the countries that are doing business with Wagner in Africa, then maybe you have a situation where it can start to work.
Okay, Vincent, since the days of the precursor to the African Union, the Organization of African Unity, and then the African Union, there's always hammered on African solutions to African problems. It's 60 years of post-colonial nationhood for a lot of African states, but why does it seem that we can't find homemade solutions, African solutions to protracted crisis in different parts of the continent, be it, Mozambique is a shining example with the SADC and Rwandese forces intervention, but in major parts of the continent where there's strife, we often look out to solutions. Is that an indictment on the African Union? And what can we do to find African solutions to African problems?
As I said earlier, the fact that the Central African Republican presidents could not go and look to the African Union peace and security forces to help and assist in the situation is a major indictment on the African Union and Africa itself. But also at the same time, it is a lot easier in some situations, some cases, for countries in Africa to look outside of the continent for who will help us and who will support us in our struggles, be it we're having a small civil war in our country, who can help us restore order. In some cases, you will have conflicts between main bodies and main actors in the region that a country belongs to that will favor different sides, and there will not be agreement. In other situations, it is easier because of former colonial ties to agree and go to international actors, be it the French, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, whoever it is, because of the benefits, be it corruption, be it past colonial ties. There are benefits that some countries have for looking outside. And lastly, look, African countries do not always bring and come to the table when they're requested to come to the table in terms of peace and security of their neighbors. The Rwandese case of their engagement in Mozambique is an interesting one to look at because here we're seeing Rwanda take its shape as a greater and more significant actor on the continent despite its small size. So, we need to always, as a mentor of mine always told me, when looking at conflicts in Africa, when looking at who comes into the conflict and supports or assists in these situations, we need to understand that who gets what, when, where, how. And we need to understand that politicians in the national governments will not do anything just for just. They will do it because there's an interest and something that they can gain in the long term or short term from having, be it the Rwandese or the French or Germans or Russians coming into the situation. And both sides will benefit in some way, shape, or form. And in many situations, African countries themselves who are on the continent cannot agree on how to make these win-win relationships occur.
Vincent, looking at this generally, I know we're talking about alliances now, but Central African Republic has been in crisis since late 12. Now, can you give us a clearer picture of how this crisis affected the livelihood of the people and even the country as a whole?
The conflict between Anti-Bellica and between the Muslim and Christians within the Central African Republic has resulted in significant amounts of displacement in the country. In addition, we've also seen greater refugee inflows into neighboring countries. Look, the country still has become a bit more stable, but there are still often, from time to time, attacks that occur in the country. It's important to look at the economy and how this crisis has impacted the economy. Central African Republic has not grown significantly since the crisis since the civil war that occurred and results in these conflicts, in the first wave of conflict and the second wave of conflict, and the reprisal attacks. Central Africa had for some time been considered a country on the African continent where Christians and Muslims lived in somewhat difficult harmony. They did not, it was not like some of the other African countries where we have constant conflicts and engagements between Christian and Muslims fighting each other over the fact that you're a Christian, you're a Muslim. But by weaponizing religion and existing grievances that existed within the country, it has resulted in the country becoming a bit less stable and requiring intervention support. There is now climate stress that is now being added to the mix. And with climate stress being added to the mix, it creates a fairly dire situation in the long run if the issues that undergirded the initial beginnings of the conflict are not addressed and managed effectively.
Thank you so much, Vincent. You've been able to tell us so much about the crisis going on in Central African Republic and, of course, the accusations that have been placed on the Russian Wagner Group. Thank you so much for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you for having me.
And right now, we'll go for a quick break. And when we come back, we'll be dealing with the issue of press freedom as journalists, and especially in Africa. We've had situations where journalists and media professionals have been barred from actually having a free press. Do join us in the second half. Thank you for joining us. You're still watching the conversation right here on News Central TV. Now, on the first belt, we dealt with situations in the Central African Republic where Russian mercenaries have actually been accused of torturing and killing civilians, of which Russian mercenaries have been involved in the Central African Republic crisis since 2012. Now we move over to the second belt where we deal with situations of press freedom. Now, looking at the continent as a whole, there are too often cases of arbitrary censorship, especially on the internet, with occasional network shutdowns in some countries, arrests of journalists and violent attacks. Press Freedom Charity Reporters Without Borders, that is the RSF, has said. Now, in its annual report released on World Press Freedom Day, RSF says there is a wide variety of experiences for journalists across Africa.
Seychelles is the top-ranking African nation in RSF's Global Index. At the number 13 out of 180 countries, it says the island nation is one of the very rare African countries in which most journalists are women. Namibia is next on the list at number 8, but both Seychelles and Namibia place higher than the United Kingdom, France and the United States. Now, joining us now is Spencer Mogapi, chairman of Editors Forum and editor of Sunday Standard. He joins us live from Gaborone in Botswana. Thank you very much for joining us, Spencer.
Thank you very much. Good evening to you
Good
guys.
evening.
Good evening to you. Now, Spencer, what's your assessment of the African media space and how free is the media in Africa?
Thank you very much. I think maybe first of all, we should congratulate both Namibia and Seychelles for having ranked so high overall. I mean, it's really an impeccable story of progress by these two African nations to have gone this far, to do much better than even the more developed countries where the freedoms of the media are more entrenched with a strong historic background. Seychelles and Namibia, especially Namibia here, which is just to the west of where I'm talking to, we know very well that it's not by coincidence, it's not accidental that they have ranked this far. They have been proactively cultivating freedoms of the civil communities. They've gone far, even of course there will still be issues, especially in the northern part of the country. But generally they have worked very hard. The laws of Namibia, the constitution, it entrenches media freedom, it entrenches freedom of expression. And it's really not a coincidence that they've come this far insofar as the rankings are concerned. And we must not forget that Namibia only gained independence in the 1990s. But for them to have gone so far, way ahead of more older countries like Botswana, my own country here, which gained independence in 1966, I think we must congratulate Namibia and Seychelles.
Definitely, congratulations to Namibia and Seychelles. Yes. Well, if you're looking at situations now, we see journalists cover stories on protests, harassment, and all sort of other stories. Now, are there actually laws that protect journalists from situations like this?
I think the problem is two-pronged. I should actually say the absence of laws that enable and facilitate the works of journalists is a problem, as also is the presence of laws that actively impede the work of journalists. I think those two are problems. If you take, for example, Botswana, our journalists continue to be arrested when there are protests. Journalists continue to be arrested when they do their work. But it's mainly here the absence of a law that covers the journalists and give them protection. But in other countries, while here the problem is the absence of such a law, in other countries it is the presence of laws themselves that actively impede, like I said, the work of journalists. So those two are a big problem. And then, of course, the issue of conflicts. Where there are active conflicts, as in Mozambique now, the journalists there find it very difficult to do their work. Number one, from both sides, whether it's the government or the insurgents. And it becomes very difficult for the journalists themselves to do their work. So generally, the story of Africa insofar as media freedom is concerned, I would say it remains a mixed bag. There are areas in Mozambique, for example, but also when you go north in Central Africa and to the west, where there are active conflicts where journalists actually get killed, they get kidnapped, they get captured. So those are the worst cases I can talk about insofar as the whole of Africa is concerned. But there are areas where improvements are being made, especially here. I'll talk about Southern Africa generally. Over the last few decades, to 20 years or so, there's been enormous improvements made to ensure that journalists can do their work. But of course, all these things depend on the attitude of who comes into power. Some people would come into power, whether through their political parties, whether it's the president, who would basically reverse all the gains that would have been made. Someone would come into power and you will see that there's an improvement overnight, extending the freedoms of the media and the like. So it's really continues to be a mixed bag generally. But of course, it also has to do with the economic part. Where the economics of the countries remain suppressed, you'll see that we also see the activities of the media being hampered in a very big way. But when there is economic improvement, we also see that hand in hand goes the facilitation of the work of the media.
Now, Spencer, looking at the African media space, it seems like government and the media are always at loggerheads, even though the media is referred to as the fourth estate of the realm after the executive, legislative, and judiciary. Why is this so?
I think it has to do with a number of factors. The first one is there is really not sufficient understanding of how the media works on the part of those in power, especially the politicians. Another issue has to do with just the critical role that the media plays. There's no appreciation on the part of those who are in power. And then it would be just the nature of the media itself always puts them in collision course with those in power. It's just the nature of the game. But for those in power to really appreciate the role that the media plays, it helps because even when there is a conflict, because such a conflict is, I would say, is inevitable. Everyone will know that each party plays a big role. Those in power have to appreciate that the media is there, number one, to inform the nation, to inform societies, to inform the communities. Number two, to also take care and ensure that those who are the weakest in the society are also protected. It has to do, I think, a lot with an understanding of just what the media does in the society.
Spencer?
Yeah, I think we lost Spencer there
All
for
right.
a bit. But, you know, it's funny how governments work. You need the media, especially during elections, to put out it's almost like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
They're nice when you need them to carry out to highlight and also talk about your programs. But when they're being critical of you, that's when it's a love-hate relationship most times.
I think it behoves on journalists to, no matter what the situation is, to do their work. You know, most times we have in situations where the people don't even believe in the media anymore. You say what's going on in the media is actually false. So I think it behoves on media professionals to actually speak the truth. When government is doing wrongly or whether government is doing right, I don't think the media should be bought at this point in time. This will enable us have a better press freedom, so as to say.
And I also believe that we need to strengthen the media space, traditional media, especially now that the media space has been democratized because of the danger of fake news. When people go to alternative news sources, it's not regulated. Somebody can just, and you know, because of human beings, they have an insatiable appetite for information. They would easily believe, and that space is not regulated. But when you have governments clamping down on press freedoms, those are some of the dangers that we might see.
Definitely, and I think we still have Spencer with us to discuss the situation of press freedom. And Gbenga was talking about a government clamping down on the press. And most times, governments use the excuse of public order or citing national security to control the press. But meanwhile, some people would say this is a situation where you're restricting press freedom, especially in a democratic government. So, Spencer, how far do you think the government can go to actually curb press, especially in the country?
And where do they strike a balance between national security and actual reporting and allowing the press to do their duty?
Yes, thank you. I think you are right when you say that government often use the pretext of national security to claim on the media. And too often when they do that, what we have seen is that they become very excessive in the use of force, very excessive in arresting the media, and they fail basically to strike the balance. Because look, once the journalists are responsible people, I would tell you, what they often do is to go for the truth. And a professional journalist would not deliberately distort information to get to whatever way they want. They always, it's a tightrope, but they often stay very close to the truth insofar as they are allowed by laws, also by those who have that information to give out to the media. But the excesses too often come from the government when they try to use security laws, when they often try to talk about national interest and the like. That is when you can see them coming full force on the media, so much so that they even arrest, close down media houses, outlaw the operations and the like. And that is very excessive. Unfortunately, like I said, we still see such incidents widely used across Africa, especially when there are active conflicts, as in Mozambique, that is when the government really find space to start using all kinds of pretexts to arrest and to harass the media. But like I said, we can always coexist if proper channels are allowed, if proper spaces are allowed, and especially if both parties, the media and those in power, understand what causes the other one is serving in the society.
Now, Spencer, we live in an age where information is fast coming by. It's very fast paced, and we've seen proliferation of media outlets, especially with the rise of social media. We've often heard of the term citizen journalists, where people just go out there and put information out there without the necessary gatekeeping that traditional media provides. My question is the media on the threat? Is journalism profession on the threat in Africa? And do you think the next generation of professionals are prepared to change the narrative of the low perception given to journalists, especially by national governments, and seeing how they're arrested and all of this clampdown on journalists?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think it's very important. The social media, especially, we must point out, has been such a big boon for the media generally. But it has also come up with serious negatives for the media. It's very difficult to keep track of where the truth is because a result of social media. But overall, it enables also the media to do their work, to cross-check the facts, to verify information and the like. But it's still important, I must point out, citizen journalism is important, but the mainstream shall always have a role to play. Why? Because it always provides the context. There's also gatekeeping that can easily be predictable. So for me, the future will depend on how the media itself conducts itself. If we are able to really professionally conduct ourselves, we have a big role to play in the future, notwithstanding all the improvements, notwithstanding all the negative impact that will come with things like social media. If we provide context, if there's proper gatekeeping, if the ethics are all in place, then we can rest assured that people will always want to find out where the truth is. And that means they will go for the mainstream media, because they would know that the channels there have been properly set up. Thank you.
Now, Spencer, if you would agree with me, I mean, all of us as journalists believe that a media actually builds an informed society. So, while still trying to keep press freedom, what ways can civil society organizations and citizens help in maintaining media freedom?
The citizens have a big role to play. Number one, the issues for which the media are often criticized mainly come from the citizens themselves. They swamp information, all kinds of fake news and the like, and the people generally get confused, not knowing who to trust, not knowing which of all these various platforms to even believe. So I think the general public have to support the media generally by, number one, calling on their governments to open the spaces. Number two, finding ways to give accurate information, because the biggest source of for the media remains the public, not the government. So if they continue to be more reliable sources, if they continue to be custodians, basically, of all the information that the media seeks, then I think, like I said, the future for the media is somewhat guaranteed. The public has a bigger role, but it is, of course, the aggressor, which is often the government, that for now we have to pay attention to and try to educate everybody to understand just what role we play as the media in our societies.
Finally, Spencer, we did talk about the advent of social media and citizen journalists, but some will argue that you wouldn't allow a citizen doctor to treat you, for example, or allow a citizen pilot to fly you. And Senegal's president has said, Macky Sall has said, he plans to regulate social media in his country, describing it as a real cancer of modern societies. Do you support the regulation of social media, knowing the impact fake news and the damage it can cause?
I'm very, very skeptical, I'm sorry to say, about regulating social media, because in the end, it is that person who is regulating social media whose views ultimately will only come out into the public. I think the public, we must trust them to be able to see where the truth is in all the various platforms.
Not everyone is responsible to self-censor and also understand the context of things. That's why some of the so-called citizen journalists are paid by politicians to put out fake news. So how do you address issues like that?
Yes, yeah. In my country here, in the past, as journalists, professional journalists, we had always resisted registered or being controlled in a way where there would be a register of journalists. But we have since seen that it might in the end save all the professional journalists if we could agree to say amongst ourselves, let's register, even without government, to know who is a journalist, who is a professional journalist, who is citizen journalist, and which radio station here you can trust, because you can run a radio station nowadays just from the comfort of your room using social media. But we still need proper ethical controls in place for the people to really consume such things and to trust it. So we are now opening up and say, let's self-regulate as the media, even without the input from a government. Why? Because we don't trust government to control us. They would, if we do that, tomorrow be saying, we do not want Spencer to practice because he has such inclinations in his reporting. So it's better if it's the journalists themselves regulating themselves.
Okay, Spencer, there's a popular saying that goes, he who plays the piper dictates the tune. Now, what role does funding actually play in facilitating or hampering press freedom, especially in countries where the government is the one funding the media? So somehow the media would actually have to play the tone of the government. What role does funding actually play?
I think you have a point. I mean, he who pays the piper plays the tune in the end. We have to be very careful about such funders, because if they are not, if they are allowed too much space, especially to be inside the newsrooms, then everything that the journalists write, what the journalists cover, is basically propaganda coming from the founders. So we have to ensure that people bringing in money to invest, to start all these big platforms for the media, they only do it, but allow the professionals who really know what the media does to be the ones at the forefront. They should allow space to the professionals. But we must also know that as professionals, we need people with money to invest in all these things, because ultimately it is the powerful media houses that can guarantee ultimately that there is freedom of expression. If the media is weak itself, then the governments and the government people, they literally overrun such media houses and control everything that comes out of them. So we need formidable structures to be in place. And for that to happen, there is need also for money and investment to flow into such platforms.
That's a fine place to leave it, Spencer. Thank you very much, Spencer Mogapi, Chairman of the Editors Forum and editor of Sunday Standard. Thanks for sharing your insight with us on this subject. And this is where we draw the curtains in today's edition of The Conversation. Join us on Friday for another episode of The Conversation. I'm Gbenga Aborowa.
And don't forget, The Conversation doesn't just stop here. You can join us on social media platforms at News Central TV. I am Rita Omodia. See you again on Friday.